we go all the way back to the election of 1824. So, our conversation for this unit starts with the era of good feelings coming to an end with the election of 1824. What we said was, going into the election of 1824, there were 4 candidates for the presidency. They included Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, William Crawford, and John Quincy Adams. And ultimately, we argued that John Quincy Adams wins that election, but not by the popular or electoral vote. He is elected by the House of Representatives. And his election by the House of Representatives is somewhat dubious. I mean, he has the second highest popular vote, the second highest electoral vote. He is second to Andrew Jackson. But Henry Clay, a candidate in that election, and the then Speaker of the House, used his influence to get Adams elected. Subsequently, Adams appointed Clay to be Secretary of State. But the Jackson people accused them of a corrupt bargain. And that corrupt bargain is going to taint the administration of Adams for 4 years. Now, by the time 1828 rolled around, and Adams had to run for re-election against Jackson, the presidential candidate that he had beaten in 24, things had changed in terms of politics. Jackson's election, his campaign in 24, his election in 28, his election in 32, Van Buren's election in 36, and Harrison's election in 40 represent the emergence of something that we call Jacksonian democracy or popular democracy. And it involved the emergence of the common man in participating in politics. And we talked about some ways and in some manners that Jacksonian democracy was manifested. One of the things, well, let's just for fun, tell me some of the ways. So when we say popular democracy, Jacksonian democracy, how is this reflected in changes in the electoral process, in voting, in whatever? Yes, go ahead, dear Danielle.
A lot more people voting?
Yes, there was wider participation. I mean, more people voted. And not only did more people vote, what was also true? More people were, not only did a greater percentage of people who were eligible to vote voted, what else, dear Felix?
There were more people involved in active politics.
Yes, I mean, I agree with that too. Not only did more people vote, more people participated in the political process, campaigning, picnics, parties, placards, posters, speeches, the things that we associate with modern politics today come into wide use during this time period. I guess when I was thinking about Richards was this. I was thinking about the eligibility of voters. More people were eligible to vote. How so, dear Richards?
Because universal white man suffrage.
Universal white manhood suffrage meant basically what was dropped. What things were dropped that had been part of voting prior. Dear Emily? Yes, up until this time there were property requirements in each state for voting. State after state had dropped those property requirements, only requiring men be of a certain age to be eligible to vote. What else did states start to do to give people more influence in the political process? Besides property requirements, yes, go ahead, Richards.
They had conventions to elect candidates.
The convention system emerged. I mean, remember, in the Constitution, there was no mechanism for nominating candidates for president. Remember, the Founding Fathers did not anticipate a two-party system. So there was no way, and there was no mechanism in the Constitution to nominate candidates. And the caucus system had been the system that had been used, and that was a caucus of representatives in Congress that would choose a candidate. It was replaced by a convention system, where each party would elect or appoint delegates who would convene in a city, and those delegates representing the party faithful across the country would choose a presidential candidate. In fact, that's what we're talking about today. we were talking about the election of 44. Today we were talking about the election of 44, and in our discussion of the election of 44, we said the Democratic Convention selected Polk to be the candidate in 44, and the Whig Convention selected Clay. What was the first political party to use the caucus system? This is kind of, maybe to some extent, trivial, but we did mention Dear Baby. It was the third party, do you recall? What? No, it's the third party. Go ahead, Amelia. It was indeed, dear Amelia, the anti-Masons. The anti-Masonic Party was the first third party in American history, and they pioneered the convention as a means of selecting political candidates. The National Republicans, soon to be the Whigs, and the Democrats followed suit, and we have that system up until today. Now, a couple of other things that your textbooks mentions that really spurs participation in politics. I mean, we talked about people voting more often, more people being eligible, more people participating in the political process, involved in campaigns. One other thing. Remember, during this time, states were increasingly deciding who would cast ballots in the Electoral College by elections. Another thing that your text mentions is the Panic of 1819 and the Missouri Compromise as spurring interest in politics. Why so? Why so? How is it that the Panic of 1819 and the Missouri Compromise could be considered, dear Natalie, to be things that encouraged wider participation in politics, in your view?
They were sort of controversial, so like more people would want their opinions heard about them.
So Natalie, what you are saying is they were controversial events that occurred, like the Panic of 1819 and like the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise was national legislation, was it not? And the Panic of 1819 was a national issue. And so it encouraged more people to vote for national candidates, where they previously might not have thought that a national candidate might have much influence on them. Particularly when slavery or the extension of slavery became an issue, people became more interested. Now, we talked about this process, this kind of evolution of more democratic. And what that means when we say more democratic means that the people have more influence in the political process. I mean, technically, we don't live in necessarily a democracy. In a democracy, the people would make direct decisions by popular majority. We have a Republican government. In a Republican government, we elect leaders who basically pass laws and execute those laws on a local and national level. But the more influence that people have over those leaders, the more democratic the republic becomes. And that's what happens during this time period, that people have more influence. Now, that being said, John Quincy Adams is elected to be president in 24 at kind of the emergence of Jacksonian democracy, and he is somewhat out of step with the sort of direction the country is going. And we talked about John Quincy Adams' frustration. He had a nationalistic agenda where he wanted to build the infrastructure of the country and to promote national prosperity, and wanted the national government to do this. He is not very successful in doing that, and as a result, he has a pretty uneventful presidency that sets the stage for the election of 1828. And in that election, Andrew Jackson sort of dramatically is elected to the presidency, and we said to some extent this is, an embodiment of popular democracy. And we talked, if you remember, about Jackson's inaugural with all the people who came and they trashed the White House, and how this was a symbol that the common folk had come to Washington. But in Jackson's presidency, there are a couple of things that come to the forefront as being important. And one of them is the whole debate over the nature of the Constitution, eventually nullification, and sort of the resolution of the nullification process. Let's go through the whole thing. Right? Let's go through the whole thing. Nullification, right? The nullification crisis, if you want to call it, comes to a head in January of 33. when would you say it started? And what was it ultimately all about?